Hello, everybody. Welcome to the John David Ebert channel. My name is Michael Aaron Kamins. I'm going to be hosting and kind of moderating a discussion today of two of my favorite and who I think are the best intellectuals and authors on contemporary philosophy and the impacts of technology and new media on consciousness and culture. John David Ebert, of course, and our very special guest, Dr. Jason Reza Jorjani. And we've been trying to arrange this for quite some time. I know there's been interest from others as well, trying to get these two guys to talk. I first reached out to Jason in, I think, 2017 after I read his a book that I think is a classic already, Prometheus and Atlas, which I think came out in 2016. It won the Parapsychological Association Book Award. It's an extraordinary book, and I reached out to Jason because the book seemed to epitomize everything that me and John and Brian Francis Calkin and a few others have been talking about under this term hypermodernity for a while, and I really do think that John wrote a book called Art After Metaphysics that came out in 2013, and I really think that these two books, Prometheus and Atlas, Art After Metaphysics, are like the two greatest books of theory and contemporary thought of the last 10 years or so, maybe more. And so this is a much anticipated conversation. Getting you guys together to talk, and just a little bit. Jason, he's a PhD in philosophy. He teaches at the New Jersey Institute of Technology on the subjects of science, technology, and society. Also, the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, the history of Iran. He's written a few books now, Prometheus and Atlas. Also. World State of Emergency, which is a really cool book as well. In this book, Jason talks about, for example, Carl Schmitt. I mentioned that because when we were doing the Hypermodernity podcast, we had an episode on the ideas of Carl Schmitt and the state of exception with the context of COVID-19. And Jason also just recently launched a website called Prometheism.com, and he published something actually on July 4th, 2020, this year, called the Prometheism Manifesto. And from what I understand, it's which I recommend everybody look that up and take a read of that. Jason describes that as a distillation of a new book he has coming out. I think this year. So the Prometheism Manifesto is a distillation of what that book is going to be about. And one of the reasons for doing this conversation is that we also have a book coming out as well. It's the second volume of the Hypermodernity trilogy with Brian Francis Calkin should be coming out in the fall, maybe in October. And so Jason was telling me that he recently read the Hypermodernity book, the first volume, and saw some overlap between his theory, his manifesto of Prometheism, and some of the stuff that me, John, and Brian have been talking about for the last few years. And so I thought this would be a really great opportunity to have them talk about Prometheism and hypermodernity. So what I thought we would do is we'll start with Jason. And Jason, if you want to fill in any details that I left out. Jason also has written some other books as well. Lovers of Sophia, also an extraordinary book. It's a book of essays on different cultural phenomena, and a book called Novel Folklore, which is really, really fascinating. And I think some other stuff as well. But what I thought, Jason, if there's anything you want to say about your work, and then tell us about this Prometheism Manifesto, and then we'll shift to John, and then John, whatever you want to say on that, and then talk about hypermodernity, and then we can kind of go in there. So we'll start with Jason. And thanks for coming on, Jason, with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, Michael, and thank you for that very gracious introduction. Let me just make a small correction before the attorneys of the New Jersey Institute of Technology demand that you take down this video. I taught past tense at NJIT until the fall of until the spring of 2018. So I'm no longer at NJIT. As far as the Prometheus Manifesto, as you said, it's a distillation of a forthcoming book called Prometheism, which will be released by Arctos Media, the same people who published Prometheus and Atlas. That should be out in September. And in this manifesto, which was the spearhead of a movement that I launched on July 4th, I basically organized my ideas around three ends, three sort of facets or aspects of a coming apocalypse: the end of humanity, the end of history, and the end of reality. And in a way, I think that this is describing the internal structure of what the two of you have called hypermodernity. So in the course of this discussion, I'd like to, see if we can, tease out points of comparison and contrast and explore interesting dynamic tensions between these two visions of the impending apocalypse. The apocalypse, which in the tech community in Silicon Valley is referred to as the technological singularity, but which in my work, beginning with Prometheus and Atlas, I've attempted to articulate in terms that are not materialistically reductionistic, that also involve a recognition of what has hitherto been perhaps inadequately termed the paranormal, and what I prefer to call spectral phenomena. So another way that you can look at the project of Prometheism in general, as it's distilled in this Prometheus Manifesto, is a restatement of the thesis of the spectral revolution from Prometheus and Atlas. And that thesis in Prometheus and Atlas of the spectral revolution was the idea that there is a coming revolution which is not simply another revolution in the history of science. It is not a paradigm shift, as Thomas Kuhn described paradigm shifts. Rather, it is a revolution that makes it possible for the first time to recognize consciously that we are working with models of nature rather than isomorphic representations of nature when we develop scientific theories. So scientific theory is a model building enterprise, I argue, and it's always paradigmatic. And once we recognize that, it's possible for us to use apparently contradictory models for different practical purposes simultaneously. So the spectral revolution is a revolution into a post-paradigmatic epoch of science, or rather one where we're not shackled by any particular paradigm, and we can use these paradigms as various atlases that allow us to achieve certain technological breakthroughs that are transformative of human existence. And specifically, I had three senses of the word spectral that I was employing in this concept of the spectral revolution. So, when Deleuze talks about specifically philosophical concepts, he claims that they have a certain internal structure. They have elements that are interrelated in a way where, they're sort of fundamentally interpenetrating, and they have a structure that can't be translated into distinct propositions. So that if you add anything to the internal structure of that concept, it falls apart. And all the elements of it are integral, but they're integral in a way that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And so there are three basic elements to this concept of the spectral revolution. One is the idea of the spectral as a spectrum. So it's a conflating and confounding of all binary oppositions, like mind and matter, life and death, the artificial and the natural, the human and the mechanical, and so on and so forth. Light and darkness, drawing from Nietzsche, also good and evil. So it's the idea of the spectrum as a confounding and conflating of all binary opposites. but then also the specter as what is yet to come, because the specter, in the sense that Marx evokes it at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, is also, the idea of ontological becoming rather than static being, of the Heraclitean flux. And this is related, as all the elements of an integral concept ought to be, this is related to the first sense of spectral, because it's the fact that we are in a world of becoming that confounds any putative binary oppositions that we would want to identify and stabilize from out of the flux. So, what is to come will always confound the oppositional categories with which we've attempted to frame existence. And then the third and final sense of spectral in Spectral Revolution is the idea of specters as ghosts or daemons. And specifically, I identify the specter of Prometheus as what Heidegger calls the essence of technology, or the spiritual force of technological inframing as it's expressed itself in the history of Western metaphysics. So Prometheus, to me, is not just any other mythic figure or iconotype, as John sometimes refers to it as. Prometheus has a unique status from out of the archetypal realm because it is the archetype that has been implicit to the mechanistic instrumentalization of the world that on the face of it is an exorcism. On the face of it, this mechanistic metaphysics that has culminated in modern technological science is a kind of movement of exorcism. But ironically, when you really reflect on its structure and its intentionality, you realize that actually we are under a kind of daemonic possession, and what is possessing us is Prometheus. And so what I'm calling for in Prometheus and Atlas, and what this Prometheus Manifesto is reaching back toward, is the demand that we consciously recognize this and take more control over the Promethean archetype that's implicitly been guiding our evolution throughout history, and our movement toward this revolution that makes the whole dynamics of this conscious to us for the first time.
That's fantastic, Jason. Thanks for that. Before I turn it over to John, just a couple of things I wanted to say on that. When you talk about the spectral, I think it's surprising to a lot of people that Prometheus and Atlas won the award for Parapsychological Association. One of the things about it is that it is a history of Western civilization and modern consciousness as a sort of suppression of, I guess I like to use the word, I'd like to call it psi abilities, PSI. I know that's not how you say the term, but one of the things that you're doing in that book is sort of like an archaeology of modern Western consciousness as a suppression of spectral, our natural spectral abilities as these parapsychological abilities. And the other thing I wanted to say was that I'm pretty sure if I remember in Prometheus and Atlas, you make a comparison between Prometheus and Faust. I think you say that that Faust is the archetype of Faust is Prometheus, and that's relevant. A lot of people know John's work for his commentary on Oswald Spengler and this idea of Western civilization as a Faustian civilization. And I just want to check that out with you. So would you say that Faustian civilization is, in the Spenglerian sense, is under the specter of Prometheus, the archetype?
Yes, I would, but there's a very specific reason why I did not use the term Faustian and went for the Promethean instead. And that's because the Faustian is necessarily post-Christian. The Faustian, I don't know if you want to call it an archetype. The Faustian, I guess Deleuze would call it conceptual persona of Western civilization, as Spengler defined it, is something that can only be formulated in the shadow of Christianity. And so, yes, the Faustian is an expression of the Promethean, but not all expressions of the Promethean are Faustian. And the Promethean precedes the conditions of possibility for the Faustian, and the Promethean may also outlive the terminal decline and collapse of Christendom. So that's one of the reasons why, I did not go with the Faustian. It's also one of the reasons why, frankly, although I wouldn't have necessarily been averse to it because I find it scandalous, I didn't go with the Luciferian. The Luciferian is also an expression of the Promethean, but again, right. it is framed explicitly against Judeo-Christianity, and therefore is dependent on it in a way that I don't think the mythic substrate of our civilization ought to be going forward into a galactic future.
Yeah, so in a way, then the Promethean, then that is really the archetype proper, right? Whereas Faust.
Let me add one thing to that. These days you have, and I want to shut up and let John talk. But these days you have people like Alexander Dugin attempting to develop the concept of a Eurasian civilization that is distinct from Western civilization, where Russia is not part of the West, but it is in effect antagonistic toward the Faustianism of the West. And yet, if you look at modern Russian intellectual history, there's this whole Russian cosmist movement with people like, Nikolai Fyodorev and Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who are radical Prometheans. And, the Russian heritage going back through Russian Orthodoxy also reaches back to the Greeks as the cradle of their civilization. So to me, the Promethean could be as appealing to the Russians as it is to Western Europeans and to Americans. And so I was going for that greater universality rather than, working with a Faustian idea that, the Russians are already setting themselves up against. Sure.
So it's a more unifying, broader conceptual category than to use Prometheus as a mythic figure and archetype. And it is the case, right, that the story of Faust is a very Christian story about he sells his soul to Mephistopheles, who's the devil, and to acquire these abilities. So that makes a lot of sense. So John, so you've been hearing this, and you also read Jason's Prometheus Manifesto, and working on the Hypermodernity Volume 2 book and everything. So what, John, and one thing that I think is about both of these books, Prometheus and Atlas and Art After Metaphysics, very different books, but what's similar about them is that they're both historical analyses in a way, whereas Jason's looking at the history of the West through this sort of suppression of the spectral. John's looking at the history of the West through transformations in art, and that we can learn a lot about metaphysics or like Western philosophy through the graphical dimension of artworks. In the introduction to Art After Metaphysics, for example, John goes all the way back to like the Paleolithic, looking at what are the semiotics of ancient cave art paintings, and what does that tell us about consciousness, and then all the way down to modernism, through the medieval macrosphere, the Christian iconotypes, and the Byzantine tradition with the golden sky, and then how that disintegrates, and with Impressionism it breaks up into these points of light, and then the modernist, what I think John calls the integral hypersphere that you can see like in Cubism, for example, and that so both books are very, very historical in an almost like sort of Heideggerian sense. One looking at spectral phenomena, one looking at art. So that's kind of one of the reasons why I'd like to talk about these two books together. But John, tell us what you think about that, and anything you want to say about hypermodernity and all this.
This Prometheus archetype is really fascinating to me because I remember Joseph Campbell in The Masks of God. He's got this idea that he calls the signatures of the four great domains. And so he divides the world geographically up into four domains. And he says, with China, the primary, I guess, as pointed out, Jason, that would be like a delusion conceptual persona. That'd be equivalent to what Campbell is saying, is that the signature of China is Lao Tzu. The Lao Tzu character is the figure who is the wandering sage who follows the Tao, and he goes where the Tao takes him. He doesn't try to control the Tao. The Tao just blows him along like a leaf is blown along by currents in a river. So that's the Chinese signature, and then he says the Indian Hindu signature, moving toward west, is the Buddha. The Buddha has his eyes closed. As far as India is concerned, the world doesn't exist. It's a dream. All their statues, if you look at all the great classical art of Indian civilization, the eyes are always closed on all the statues. Out there did not exist as far as India was concerned. But then as you go further west now, we get into the Levantine world, where he says the primary archetype there is Job. The Job narrative is this idea of submission to God. It's the same thing in Islam. Islam means submission to Allah. So it's the same idea in Judaism with Job, that Job thinks he's wronged by God, and he gets into a sort of contest with God, and of course he loses because God intimidates him, Yahweh, and says, you little worm, where were you when I created the foundations of the world? You don't know what you're talking about. A little bit like a pissed off father who knows the kid has a point. Then we move further west, and he says the Western archetype, and here he lumps together what we've been saying, Faustian is one thing, Promethean is another. He lumps them together and says Prometheus is the primary archetype of the West, because if you read Aeschylus's play, Prometheus Bound, Prometheus says, I care nothing for Zeus. He can do as he likes. So that's the Western attitude, that the authorities can go fuck themselves. As far as we're concerned, we don't care about submission to a higher god, a higher deity, or anything like that. We're going to figure this shit out for ourselves. And that mentality does indeed begin with the Greeks. The Greeks are the first to say, I am a self-responsible citizen, not the subject of a king. The king of kings idea is old, outdated, and something that came out of the Middle East, out of Mesopotamia and Samaria. We're not interested in that. We are interested in using our brains as self-responsible, rational citizens of a polis to figure things out for ourselves. And so, indeed, Prometheus comes along. We get the birth of science for the first time. It's very sloppy science, though. It doesn't have much of an experimental method or much of a methodology. It's kind of higgledy-piggledy. But then, which is right, I think, but then Spangler then makes a distinction between two different civilizations, and he says that the Northwestern civilization is not the same as the great Promethean civilization, which he calls Apollonian. It's not the same thing. With the Northwestern civilization, it's Faustian, specifically Faustian, because Faust is interested in everything. Faust has this idea that there should be no bounds to knowledge. There should be no limits on what we can know. And as far as the Greeks were concerned, there were limits. There's a reason why they anathematized Aristarchus when he came up with the Copernican, an early draft of the heliocentric Copernican hypothesis, and they anathematized that. I think the Greeks got disorientation anxiety the moment they thought about infinite space. The moment they thought about, well, if all the planets are going around the sun, then Giordano Bruno's the sequel to that. There must be lots of suns with lots of planets orbiting around them, which has just, of course, recently been figured out by astrophysicists with these exoplanets. So Bruno was right. He burned for it, but he was right. But Faust it's a different archetype because it has to do with the elimination of all taboos, the elimination of all boundaries to knowing about anything. And the Northwestern civilization, whatever you want to call it, Faustian, Toynbee, interestingly enough, makes a distinction in a study of history between the northern part of this civilization and the southern part. He calls the northern part Promethean because the north is always thinking forethought. It's always ahead of the game, whereas the south is Epimethean because it's stuck with France and Spain and Italy. It's stuck in the Mediterranean mentality. It remains Catholic and stuck in these old, outdated Mediterranean forms, whereas the Germanic North was the world who has been resisting the South all along, ever since the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, with Arminius defeating the troops of the Romans and saying, you shall not cross the Rhine. This is our world here. And of course, out of that Promethean, thoroughly Promethean world, then comes the printing press, and all the great scientists are northern, maybe other than Galileo, for a reason. They come out of that northern Promethean tradition. But nonetheless, whether you cut it that way or whether you cut it the way Spengler cuts it, as the whole thing is Faustian, north and south, it didn't seem like it ever occurred to Spengler to make a distinction that the Rhine was a kind of, that these are two cultures. And I have a theory in a lot of my other books that these high civilizations are usually two cultures. Egypt is a classic case with Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Those are two distinct societies, not civilizations, but societies that become unified. And the tension between them somehow drives the thermodynamic engine of that civilization. The same can be said for Mesopotamia with the Sumerians and the Akkadians, two totally different peoples. The Akkadians are Semites. We don't know what the Sumerians were. They weren't Indo-Aryan, they weren't Semitic, but that tension between them drives that civilization. And I think that in the case of the West, it has been the tension between north of the Rhine, south of the Rhine. The Protestant aniconic world comes out of north of the Rhine, which is aniconic and a realm of the word, and the south is more the realm of the image. All the great, Catholic artists come out of the south. So it's interesting that you use this archetype. I think it's a great idea. I like the archetype a lot. I like this idea of Prometheism because it really is, the Prometheism in the West is what the West specializes in, stealing the fires from the gods, because we take everything that was previously regarded as taboo and we say, we're going there. We don't care. There's a story in the Shahnameh, which I know you know about, Jason. I've heard you mention it in some of your videos. There's a story in the Shahnameh about King Kamins. So there's this character in there named King Kamins, and he decides he's going to build this contraption for himself. So he has this Promethean idea that he's going to build this contraption that will be like a chariot or a throne that he can sit in, and it's pulled by 4 eagles, who each has a piece of meat in front of the eagle, so it leans forward to get the meat and can't get it, like the horse with the carrot. And that motion takes this thing up into the spheres, the realm of the world of the spheres. And but it falls, it collapses, it fails, and it crashes to the earth. He survives the wreck, but then his courtiers chastise him, and they all say, see, those realms are hidden from us, mortals down here on earth. Those are the realms that are proper to God, and you shouldn't be messing around with that stuff. And that becomes like the moral of the story, that some secrets should not be touched. They are proper to the realm of God, not humans. But my final point here is that the Persians are never going to go to the moon. They're wonderful. I love them, but they're not going to go to the moon. That's so already you can see myths and narratives are like DNA for a culture. They code for what happens on the physical plane. And but the Faustian civilization, Faustian/Promethean, is like, we're going there. We're going to those spheres. Move aside. So anyhow, I'm just playing around here with ideas, but I like this. So,
so if I may,
Jason, go ahead.
Say a few words about that. It's good that we got very quickly to a fundamental point of disagreement. So I think not only will the Persians go to the moon, the Persians will explore the galaxies, and I'll tell you why. That story in the Shahnameh about Kaykavus is reaching back to the story about how Jamshid has Devs or Devas carry his throne into the heavens. And Persepolis in the Persian language, the city-state that was the capital of the Achaemenid Empire, in the Persian language, Persepolis is called Takht Jamshid, or the throne of Jamshid. And Jamshid's ascension into the stars, which is seen as a kind of Luciferian act of hubris, is actually the commemoration of Nowruz, the Persian New Year. So every Nowruz is a kind of reiteration and reaffirmation of this Luciferian hubris. The reason that I think the Promethean is a uniquely universal archetype, to the point where it's undercutting it and underplaying its significance to segregate it to one or another segment of Western civilization, is that the Promethean is older even than the Greeks. One of the points that I make in Prometheus and Atlas, which then is, I think, elaborated in some of my subsequent works, particularly Iranian Leviathan, is that if you look at the Gothas of Zarathustra, which were probably composed at least a couple of centuries before Heraclitus, if not earlier. Yeah. Well, there's a big debate over that. But at any rate, they're prior to Aeschylus. If you look at the Gothas of Zarathustra, Zarathustra's idea of Mazdai Ahura, the wise titan, whose chief attribute is Sepantominu, or the progressive or evolutionary mind, is basically the most abstract version of the Prometheus archetype that you could arrive at. So in Zarathustra's worldview, you have an antagonism between two cosmic forces, and one is a force of creation, increasing complexity, expansion of forms in nature, and also an expansion of consciousness. It's associated with fire and dynamism. And that's Spenta Minu, or the progressive mentality, which is the chief attribute of this Titan of wisdom. And it is always pushing against, it's always in a rivalry with a force of constraint, sort of niggardliness, meanness, that is attempting to stabilize and ossify everything. And this is called Engera Menu, which literally means the knotted up or constricted mentality. Later, it's turned into Ahriman, and Ahriman becomes the prototype for Satan in the Judeo-Christian theology.
That's correct.
But the point is that, you know, when you look at it in terms of the Yahwist idea of the Judeo-Christian theology, it's been inverted because, you know, what was the ideal of Ahura Mazda for the Persians is what becomes Lucifer effectively in the Judeo-Christian theology, and vice versa. The god of order and hierarchy and commandments revealed from on high and human obedience and servitude. These are the characteristics of Ahriman as Zarathustra understood it. So I would say that what happened in the tragic age of the Greeks, what Nietzsche and Heidegger called the tragic age of the Greeks, what happened in the period of Aeschylus is that the Greeks encountered for the first time a culture with a theology that they couldn't simply analogize to their own. You had all this religious syncretism take place where, you know, the god Hermes was syncretized with the ancient Egyptian Thoth. And then, you know, when the Romans appropriated the Greek culture, there was the syncretism between Mercury and Hermes. So you had Mercury, Hermes, Thoth. And you find this with, you know, with Aphrodite and Ishtar, and then later the syncretism of Venus and Aphrodite, and so on and so forth, right? So you had all these pagan cultures that the Greeks could find some analog of their gods in the pantheons of these societies. But this didn't work with the Persians. They came up against a relatively abstract philosophical theology in Zoroastrianism. And moreover, one which valorized human industriousness, creativity, and progress, and which for the first time elaborated a teleological vision of history. I mean, this was unheard of in the entire classical epoch, frankly. And I think that it's because of this encounter with the idea of Ahura Mazda, which was a very tangible encounter, you know, in terms of the mass migration of, like, God knows, hundreds of magi to Ionia during the Persian colonization of Greece. And, you know, it's been documented that there was a relationship between Heraclitus and Darius the Great. I think it's in this cultural milieu that Prometheus, who existed, of course, in the archaic Greek pantheon, was valorized to the extent that he was by Aeschylus and made the central tragic figure of Greek culture. So I would say that, you know, contrary to Spengler's analysis, let alone Toynbee, who's not even considering the Mediterranean to be a Promethean, I would say that the Promethean extends through the entire Indo-European world, and that it has a uniquely universal humanizing potential. And that it's, you know, when Deleuze talks about the universalizing force of Hellenism and how unique it is in human history, and here he's kind of drawing from Husserl and the crisis of the European sciences, I would say it's that Promethean archetype that gives Hellenism its unique world colonizing force. And it's a force that I think still has not exhausted itself.
There's but also behind that story about King Kavus and the Shahnameh is that there's a much, much older story that's behind it archaeologically that goes back to the Akkadians. It comes from the city of Kish in Mesopotamia. And Kish was a Semitic city, it was Akkadian mostly. And they came up with this narrative about Etana. Etana is the first man ever to fly on the back of an eagle into spheres, just like Kavus did, except that his journey was a success. Unlike Kavus's, the narrative as we have it says that Etana was a man who was looking, his wife wanted to get pregnant, he was having trouble getting her pregnant. She's like, go find this rare herb that will cure my condition. So he has to go out, find this herb for his wife, and he's wandering around. But meanwhile, there's a little mini story about a serpent and an eagle who have gotten into a fight because while the eagle was away hunting, the serpent went up to the tree and ate the young of this eagle. So the eagle comes back to the tree and is like, what the fuck happened to my offspring here? And it finds out very quickly that it was the nearby snake. So it goes down to do battle with the snake, and the snake actually has its wings ripped off. So this eagle now loses its wings, and it's stuck in this pitiful condition in this pit. And Etana comes wandering by. You can imagine the Sumerian desert, Euphrates, and so forth. He comes wandering by, and he sees this wingless eagle in this pit, and he says to it, wow, how did this happen? And the eagle tells him what happened, and he's like, well, let me see what I can do for Etana. Apparently, he was one of the kings of Kish, and he apparently had mechanical skills, so he's like Jamshid, and he says, okay, I'm going to build you a set of copper wings. I know I'm a coppersmith. I know how to do this. So he makes these copper wings, and he attaches them to the eagle. He's like, this is great. I've always wanted to fly. Can you take me up to the sphere of Venus? Because Venus is the planet associated with Ishtar. And he wants to go there because he thinks Ishtar can tell him where this herb is, this magical herb to get his wife pregnant. So he gets on the back of this eagle, and they try once, and it doesn't work, and it falls back down. They try a second time, and it doesn't work. And of course, you know the myth motif, it's always 3 times. So the third time, it works, and he flies out of the spheres up to Venus, where Ishtar is there sitting on her throne. She's got a couch, and she's got these regal lions. She was the lion goddess par excellence, the original lion goddess, like Cybele later is. And then she's got her lions with her, and she says, what are you doing here? You're immortal. You belong down below. He's like, yeah, but my wife... He sounds a little henpecked, doesn't he? He's like, yeah, but my wife wants me to find this herb so she can get pregnant. And Ishtar then grants him the herb, and he goes back. And according to the Sumerian king lists, he did indeed have an offspring. So apparently the herb worked. But my point is that the Mesopotamians here sort of more belong to the West, I think, than, let's say, Egypt does. There are a lot of backward characteristics about Egypt that I don't think are characteristic of the Mesopotamians, who I think were much more forward-looking, much more interested in technology, and already have the Promethean spirit about them. And this is a civilization that is going to go to the moon because they have the myth for it. It eventually, you know, it took us a long while to get our Sumerian legacy through 19th century archaeology and then 20th century archaeology. But we did it. We got Gilgamesh eventually, which is one of my all-time favorites. But so I would just add that in. That I think the West it's already pregnant there with where it's going to go. It's going to go to the sphere.
Let me just make a rejoinder to that. Going back to something you said earlier about how all the great civilizations have at least two main components, and this contributes to their vitality.
Yeah.
To their vitality and their endurance. I take your point about the Mesopotamians, but you know, the Persians are not Mesopotamians. They colonized Mesopotamia, but they're Indo-Europeans. But there is an interesting distinction between the Persian branch of Iranian civilization and the Scythian branch. And within the Iranian civilization, this duality is similar to the one between the Mediterranean peoples and the Northern European peoples in Western civilization. where you have these northern Iranian Scythians who are ethnically much more identical to Europeans, and who ultimately interbred with the Goths as part of the barbarian invasions of Europe during the collapse of the Roman Empire. It wasn't just Germanic peoples coming down into the Mediterranean world. It was also masses of Iranian Scythians and Sarmatians, these northern Iranian people, migrating from the area above Persia into the ruins of the Roman Empire. So in the Iranian civilization and the Iranian branch of the Indo-European world, you also have this duality between the Persians, who kind of, they became a hybrid culture, incorporating so many elements of Mesopotamian civilization, and then the Scythians, who are in some ways the cultural bridge between the Iranian branch of the Indo-European world and the European branch. So I totally agree with you that, you know, the great civilizations have this kind of dynamic interplay between two, I don't know what you want to call them, sub-civilizational components, you know, two supercultures that often fight wars with one another, but that also cross-fertilize. So, for example, every time the Persians came to a point of collapse, after basically the collapse of every Persian empire, the Scythians came down and revitalized Iran, ethnically and culturally and so forth. This is still relevant today. This kind of internal dynamics of civilization is still relevant today, insofar as the conflict between the Russians, who are now becoming so alienated from other Europeans that they want to define themselves as a different civilization from the West, as a kind of Eurasian or Orthodox civilization, the tension between the Russians on the one hand and then the Westerners on the other, Americans and Europeans, could wind up playing that role of, you know, two elements in a single civilization, which, if they can manage to get along well enough and have a proper dynamic interplay, could revitalize that civilization and contribute to its endurance.
I have this idea, I like this, because I have this idea about Persian civilization. It's part of what Toynbee called the second generation of civilization. He divides, unlike Spengler, he divides civilizations into three distinct generations, and he has the first generation with the Mesopotamian civilization and the Egyptian, with two satellite societies, with the Harappans in India and then the Cretans to the west. Both of those come in about 2500 BC, about 1,000 years after the first two. And these civilizations, if you look at all four of them, the two small ones and the two large ones, are fundamentally theological and mythological. There's nothing philosophical about them. They never developed the intellect to the point where it could think abstractly enough to philosophize. But when the second generation of civilization comes in, and the Persians are part of the second generation, the Persians, the Chinese, the Persians, the Hindus, the Greeks, all come in out of the result of these migrating Indo-Aryans, Indo-Europeans, who go down into all these old dying societies that are left over from these great behemoths of the first generation of high civilization. And they invade them. They bring in two-wheeled chariots. They're riding on horseback. All this new mobility. This comes in with what Paul Virilio calls the dromosphere, which now begins to accelerate to these nomadic speeds that then come down, crash into these societies, and then seed them with a fusion, once again, of two separate cultures here. The Indo-Aryan culture, which is based on speed, motility, and it has a whole worldview of everything is based on impact, with the agrarian populations in these societies that have been there forever. They fuse together, and then we get the second generation of civilization with the Dorian Greeks who come in after the Mycenaeans, and we get the Rig Veda coming in with the Hindus, and we get Zarathustra most likely, I think, dating from about 1,000, because the Gothas are, the language of the Gothas is very similar to the language of the Rig Veda, so those two people cannot have been far apart for very long. So I reject the 500 BC hypothesis for the origins of Zarathustra. I think it belongs to 1,000. But so you get these civilizations who come in, and with China, of course, we don't have Indo-Aryans, but we do have nomads nonetheless. They're basically the same type of people, steppe nomads, riding horses and bringing in chariots, who now begin with the second generation of civilization to invent philosophy. And every single one of them can now think abstractly. We get the Upanishads in India. We get the Gothas with Zarathustra. we get Chinese philosophy, eventually we get Greek philosophy. This whole second generation seems to have been powered. It's almost as though the Indo-Aryan, Indo-Europeans traded the motility of horseback for the motility of thought, and then also in the West brought in with the alphabet, with the Greeks and the Phoenicians and so forth, a new ability to think even more abstractly now with an aniconic, non-pictographic language that lays the foundations for high abstract thought that eventually becomes the academy. And so it's interesting. I like this idea of Prometheism being a much broader concept than just the West, because it makes a lot of sense to me with this second generation of civilization coming in, being Promethean, because all of these civilizations, when they get up and running, start bringing in innovations. They start becoming Promethean in a way, except I think for China. I do think that China, despite it does have a great philosophical tradition, nonetheless, the cult of the ancestors weighed so heavy on them that it really prevented them from, they did develop philosophy, but it seems like they felt guilty about it because they're always burning the books, right? They invent it, but they're like, well, maybe we shouldn't have done that. Let's burn it. Let's get rid of it. So they're going back and forth, eliminating the worlds that they were stepping into. But it's the cult of the ancestral dead, the filial piety. You read Confucius's Analects, and it's just full of all these ideas about you have to respect your elders. If something happens to your elders, you need to take them in, or you could be punished or even put to death. I mean, there's this obsession with filial piety and dealing with parents that made, the voyages of Zheng He, when he, in around 1500, may have discovered the New World. And then he has to go back, and there's a change of emperor, and the new emperor comes in and makes him burn all his maps and all his records. So we lost that knowledge, whatever he found. But anyhow, China's a little different. But so I'd throw that out there as a kind of amplification about what you're saying, Jason.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier that Joseph Campbell sees Lao Tzu as China's signature. If only that were true. It's really Confucius. It's unfortunately Confucius. Lao Tzu, Taoism has had only a very small minority following in China since the beginning of that tradition. And in Prometheus and Atlas, I draw an instructive comparison between Lao Tzu and Heraclitus. And I point to why it is that the Promethean tradition of, the Promethean tradition is the wrong word, Promethean trajectory of empirical science came from out of Heraclitus's metaphysics rather than what on the face of it seems to be some very similar ontological insights on the part of Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. But be that as it may, at least if Chinese civilization were grounded in Lao Tzu, I think there would be a possibility for a deeper engagement with China. But as you suggested, it's not. It's really all these paternalistic, ancestor-worshipping, Confucianist ideas that are really radically inclined toward totalitarianism and the ossification of culture. They're extremely regressive. And so I'm very concerned with a Chinese monopoly on emerging technologies. And this is a subject that I first broached in my second book, World State of Emergency, and that I'm returning to in a big way in Prometheism. This book that's going to be out in September is like a fusion of the concerns of Prometheus and Atlas with those of World State of Emergency. And that's reflected in the manifesto on Prometheism.com. In the Prometheus Manifesto, you see that I take very seriously the prospect that this technological singularity could be controlled and we could be shepherded through that vortex by the Chinese civilization, which I think would wind up being a catastrophe for humanity. If the Chinese, for example, are allowed to determine the ways in which emerging biotechnologies are applied, if they lead for 10 to 20 years in the realm of genetic engineering, various applications of CRISPR and so forth, because of overly restrictive policies in Western countries, I think we're going to be already on a trajectory. We're already going to have a momentum that takes us in the direction of dehumanization through these singularity level technologies rather than an enhancement of those human capacities that would allow us to flourish. So, rather than a degradation of our humanity through modifications of certain genetic correlates of various personality traits, through, who knows, even perhaps the cloning of political elites in a reflection of an ancestor worshipping culture, rather than see those kinds of dehumanizing applications of biotechnology and other singularity level developments, I'd like to see them be used for an enhancement of the creative potential of the individual. And we have to also keep in mind, and this is one of those points that's extremely politically incorrect, but we have to keep in mind that there are real IQ differences between ethnic populations, and that the Chinese have the highest average IQ in the world. And if we allow a society that, as it is, at least in terms of mathematical and spatial reasoning, which translates very easily into, say, military breakthroughs in military technology, if we allow this to be the culture that uses gene splicing to further enhance IQ, or even uses embryo selection to further enhance IQ by as much as 15 points per generation over the next 30 or 40 years, we may wind up with a gap that it's impossible for us to close. Especially when you think about the Chinese government, albeit in secret, considering putting various aspects of their planning and policy making in the hands of artificial intelligences. This is something that has to be nipped in the bud. We have to make sure that they don't lead in the responsible integration of these technologies.
I don't think they will, for the following reason. Highest average IQ, maybe, that's fine, but a trepidity about stepping into new waters. And I think that's the problem with China because of its ancestor worship and its cult of dead. It's always backward looking, and the ancestors always say no to the new, the new, the new, the new. And I created these two archetypes in one of my books. Actually, it was an unpublished book, The Wonder Child versus the Elders. And the elders are a Far Eastern phenomenon. It's like the further east you get, the more the elders become the primary thing retarding cultural development. China was, Joseph Needham, in his History of China, portrayed this falsehood. It's a total falsification, that China was the precocious technological civilization par excellence, and it was a total falsehood. Yeah, they had these inventions, clocks and fireworks, or whatever you want, but those inventions come few and far between, very few and far between. They're rare, considering that Chinese history spans 3,000 years, as does India. They're extraordinarily rare, and they're always inventing things and then going, maybe we shouldn't have done that. And then they'll invent something and then legitimize it by backdating it to one of the emperors, one of the founding characters. Like Shen Nung is the founder supposedly of agriculture, but the Chinese didn't have, until 500 BC, they didn't have any iron implements in their agriculture. And once it comes in 500 BC, then they're like, oh yeah, Shen Nung invented this 2,000 years ago. He was out of agriculture, but he also had this other invention, and he wanted to wait till the right time. Wait till the time was right to bring it out. Same thing with a lot of Buddhist texts. One of the ways in which they resolve theological controversies in Buddhism by saying, oh, well, these Mahayana texts, the Buddha had them. He was just sitting on them, waiting for the right time. So that's how innovation is dealt with in ancestor worship type societies. They do these, they cheat. They backdate. They backdate these things, but I don't think that the Chinese will lead in these areas that you're about worried about here, because of that trepidity about they always feel guilty about every fucking thing they invent. They somehow feel guilty about it, and there's either a book burning or a map burning or a lockdown or an expulsion of Buddhists and Taoists. They're always trying to fight innovation and stick with the past. Whereas the West has the archetype of the wonder child. Achilles is the first wonder child in the West. He's the youngest of all the Greek heroes. He's about 20. He's way younger than all of them. And that text is all about his agon with Agamemnon, who is a much older man, maybe 45, maybe 50. And the two of them fighting back and forth over who has the right thing to say here about what to do. in the Trojan conflict. And so Achilles goes and sulks in his tent, and he's gone for most of the epic, and Agamemnon makes one stupid strategic mistake after the next in the Iliad that gets the Greeks in a worse and worse and worse situation until Achilles then has to come out of his tent and save them. So that's the archetype of the wonder child right there. And ever since then, the West has always looked to the kid. The Steve Jobs in his garage is going to save us. He's the wonder child. He's the kid with the new, the new, the new. And so our elders are, of course, now the elderly. We just shove them into old nursing homes. We don't care about them. We want the new kid. The kid's going to save us. The Spielbergian wonder child kid with all the gadgets. And so it's totally opposite, from the whole Chinese mentality. I think if anything's going to happen with new technologies, it will be the West leading it. I'm not afraid of China in this respect. I'm just not.
Well, this could be a good place to shift gears a little bit, relevant to what you're touching on now. But one quick thing is that, John, with the Wonder Child, you do also talk about how the image of Christ gets younger, over time, and that the Wonder,
of God, the Yahweh,
until you get the Christ Child on the lap, which was a good representation of what you're saying. I also want to point out that Jason's latest book, his most recent book, is called Iranian Leviathan, and I assume, Jason, many of the things that you are saying are in that book. On this particular point of difference with you and John does Iranian Leviathan explore?
Yes, most definitely, yes. Although even in the chapter, the postmodern Prometheus, that chapter in Prometheus and Atlas, where I talk about the history of the Prometheus archetype going all the way back to Aeschylus, there is already a discussion of the cultural historical matrix for the rise of the Prometheus icon in the context of the Persian colonization of Greece, and a comparison between Ahura Mazda and Prometheus. That's already there in that chapter of Prometheus and Atlas. But then, of course, Iranian Leviathan involves an extensive exegesis of Zoroastrian thought and its development and degeneration throughout the course of history. Just a small point about that. One of the questions that I changed my mind on throughout the years involving Zarathustra and Zoroastrianism is this dating of Zarathustra. John, I used to think that Zarathustra was perhaps even older than 1000 BC. I was more in that school of thought, that he was at least 1000 BC, if not earlier. But if you take a look at my argument in Iranian Leviathan, I come to the conclusion that Zarathustra is using the Gothic language, what's called Avestan today. And we don't know, frankly, what that language was called, but he's using that language the way that Descartes uses Latin, as a language that had prestige, and that a document that's supposed to be a fundamental contribution to theology ought to be written or composed in that language. But for various reasons, I suggest that at the time when he used it, it was already a dead language and was really being used for, ceremonial or scholastic purposes. And so by dating Zarathustra to about 600 BC, what I wind up arguing is that he is the first pre-Socratic philosopher, that really we should see Zarathustra as the first link in the chain that goes through Pythagoras and Heraclitus, both individuals who had a direct relationship with the Persian court.
That's really interesting. I love that idea. That's a really cool way to solve that problem, because it does feel like Zarathustra belongs in what Jaspers called the axial age, right? Which he dates it at 500 BC, 500 to 200. And he does seem to be one of these types of men who comes along like Pythagoras and Lao Tzu and all these guys across the board, 500 BC, as an axial age philosopher. That's really interesting. That would solve that problem. I like that a lot. I've never heard that.
I'll tell you one other thing you've never heard before, and this might sound crazy on the face of it, but take a look at the argument for it in Iranian Leviathan. I argued that Lao Tzu was a Scythian who was wandering in China, and that he was not Chinese.
Jason, stop. You're going too far now. No, I'm just giving you shit.
That's great. That's good stuff. Well, one thing I wanted to touch on. And obviously we're in a time right now. It's very overly politically charged. Division in this country and in the world, I think it hasn't been like this in any time that I can remember. But there's something about both of you that I think is really refreshing, really cool, which is that neither of you, in terms of, let's say, the right and left divide, both of you seem to transcend that in a way. And I think that in the Prometheus Manifesto, Jason, you sort of make explicit what you mean by sort of being trans or post left and left right, that binary distinction. And for one thing, I was listening to an interview you did I think maybe a month or so ago, where you say that you're as much a romantic as a futurist, and you have criticisms of what you call the traditionalist right. And so I was wondering if you could say more about that, because in the Prometheus Manifesto, I mean, the first line is that you say it's a declaration of war. And this is a manifesto in the sort of modernist tradition of manifestos, which is, in a way, that makes it hyper-modern. We think of hypermodernity as an intensification of modernity in a certain sense. We're sort of seeing this returning of manifestos, kind of, even the hypermodernity books are kind of like manifestos as well. But in the Prometheus Manifesto, you get into this idea where, well, I was wondering if you could say more about what you mean. There's even a term I heard you use, archaeofuturism. And could you say more about that, about what separates you from the traditionalist right, but yet at the same time, the importance that you place on tradition, in terms of like the Western canon and a discipline, in a literary and intellectual tradition that we associate with the West.
Sure. So, when I talk about the end of humanity in the Prometheus Manifesto, or in the book that ultimately is going to explore this in much greater detail and depth, when we consider the radical ways in which genetics, robotics, information, and nanotechnology threaten to alter the basic parameters of human existence, we also have to recognize that every fundamental institution of all human societies throughout recorded history is threatened by these emerging technologies. To give a few examples, molecular nanotechnology makes it possible to engineer robots that are the size of insects, and that would be able to, and on the face of it would appear to be, biological insects, and would be able to provide ubiquitous surveillance to whoever was controlling them. And although initially these would be devices employed by governments, we already have had wasp-sized drones used in the Iraq War by special forces. And eventually, as with all other technologies, I mean, the internet began inside the Pentagon. These things will be cheaply produced, they'll be miniaturized, and wind up being disseminated into the public sphere. So there will come a point when, I know Radio Shack went out of business, but as they used to say, you could walk into Radio Shack and buy these things.
That's news to me. Damn.
Yeah.
This is serious.
Yeah, it was a staple of 80s culture, sadly no longer with us. But yeah, these technologies will be widely available. So if you think of the ubiquitous surveillance capability of nanotechnological robots, what happens to personal privacy at that point? Furthermore, when they talk about the Internet of Things, computers embedded in all surfaces, where all of the surfaces around you are effectively screens, like the surface of your table, intelligent walls, which can turn into landscapes, right? Oh, wonderful, you can feel like you're surrounded by a forest in your own room. Well, no, not really. That's a two-way screen. You can also be monitored constantly by whoever can hack that technology. And so we are being enmeshed in a kind of technological web that allows for ubiquitous surveillance. And let me just make a note that this also will force us to think about telepathy and clairvoyance in a different way. I think one of the main reasons, I argued in Prometheus and Atlas, one of the main reasons why clairvoyance and ESP in general have been suppressed is because subconsciously we're appalled at the prospect of having our privacy so thoroughly invaded that other people could have a clear view of what goes on in our private spaces and even peer into our minds and see things within our own psyche that even we don't want to look at ourselves, right? And this is one of the reasons why ESP and clairvoyance have been suppressed. But it's going to be a lot easier for people to employ nanobots and to hack smart surfaces inside a home in order to surveil you than it is for them to use clairvoyance or extrasensory perception to violate your privacy. So, those ideas, those latent human capacities will actually, I think, become a lot less threatening by comparison to the violation of privacy and of personal integrity that is posed to us on the part of these emerging technologies. So one of the things that we've taken for granted in every human society is personal privacy, at least on some basic level. And you're going to have that challenged by these emerging technologies. I think that various types of genetic engineering also call into question, biological reproduction and the relationship between the sexes. They call human sexual dimorphism into question. It's going to be possible. You talk in Hypermodernity about the whole transgender phenomenon. How prevalent the discourse of transgenderism has become in this epoch. And I wager that with the rise of CRISPR, you're going to eventually see biological instantiations of androgyny and of transsexual identity. That in the near future, there is the possibility that we will have more than two sexes, tangibly, walking about in the world. And there's also potentials for reproductive technologies that will further erode the primacy of the family structure, of the traditional family structure. So, there are all kinds of ways in which these emerging technologies threaten the traditional structures of most human societies. And in the Prometheus Manifesto and in the project of Prometheism in general, I actually am affirming that transformative potential. But I'm suggesting that the only way we can responsibly integrate these technologies and allow them to transform us in a way that's empowering, that's superhuman rather than dehumanizing, is if we understand the archetype that's driving this development. And for that, we have to be able to reaffirm our canon and our heritage, our shared history, and not, tear down basically every intellectual and literary inheritance that we have, which would give us the opportunity, which affords us the possibility of coming face to face with the archetype that's unconsciously driving us. All that will do will be to deracinate us and leave us at the mercy of the most dehumanizing ways in which these technologies could transform society. So I am very much opposed to any traditionalist reaction to singularity level technologies that would be regressive, that would want to put the brakes on development, that possibly would even want to bring about a controlled demolition of advanced industrial society, and would be cynical enough to use, let's say, the discourse of deep ecology to do that. I'm very opposed to that kind of a traditionalist reaction. And in a way, I embrace the most radically leftist vision of the overcoming of all forms of alienation through the possibilities afforded to us by advanced technology. But we can only do that in a conscious, deliberative, and conscientious way. in a way that, Heidegger would have characterized as authentic. We can only do that in an authentic way if we become conscious of the Promethean ethos that's been implicit and tacitly operative in our civilization. And we cannot do that if we throw out the canon or tear down all those monuments that reaffirm our sense of collective identity. So I am in a sense, building upon and endorsing the monumental conception of history that Nietzsche and Heidegger are working with, while embracing the radically transformative potential of these technologies to affect the total overcoming of alienation that Marx, I think, really was envisioning in his critique of capitalism.
So yeah, it's great. It kind of reminds me of what you're saying when Carl Jung says, sort of asks us as a prescription, what myth am I living? So what is the myth that we are living as a society? And you're saying it's the Prometheus myth and the Prometheus archetype, and that if we can get a handle on that, we can understand that, become conscious, make that conscious, then it opens up a space that not only can transcend some of this binary between left and right, but that can allow us to utilize these technologies responsibly, also creatively in overcoming alienation, but at the same time not at the expense of all of the positive gains of our civilization. And so I really like that idea of sort of, it is kind of, I know Jung is not someone that you talk about very often, but I do see that as part of the Jungian idea of making the unconscious conscious, making this Prometheus archetype more conscious, and then sort of embodying it and living it in a responsible way. What is the myth that we are living? Because it's almost like, we don't choose our myths. We don't choose our gods. Which I think Wolfgang Gigerich, a Jungian, post-Jungian analyst in Berlin, says. The gods, we find them here. It's kind of like Heidegger's idea of we find ourselves in the world, so thrown into a world. Same thing with gods or archetypes. They're already there. We're already in a myth, and we have to make it conscious. So this connects to something else too with Heidegger when he says, which is something that's always baffled me, and I've tried to. Sometimes I think I understand, and sometimes I don't. Which is when he says, in the Der Spiegel interview later on in his life, when he says, "Only a God can save us now." Is this kind of what you mean? Is the God Prometheus and becoming conscious of that God and conscious of? Is that going to? Is it that we? Because it's almost like, yeah. So exactly. Go on.
Yes. So two things. First, to go backwards, I suggest in the book Prometheism that when Heidegger was talking about the coming God in the Der Spiegel interview, that he requested not be published until his death, until after his death. He is evoking Prometheus. And, that statement is made in the specific context of the challenge of world inframing technologies. And, he makes this very controversial statement that has to do with why he committed himself to National Socialism in the 1930s in that Der Spiegel interview. This is, of course, why he requested that it only be posthumously published. And his statement was that it was the only socio-political system at the time, and here you have to remember Marinetti and Italian futurism and the connection between Italian futurism and fascism in general in Europe in that epoch. Heidegger claimed that it was the only socio-political system that even was contemplating a serious confrontation with world inframing technologies, with the age of the world picture in all of its most deleterious consequences for human existence. And so given that he's talking about the coming God and, as he puts it, what may happen to man in 300 years, given that that's the kind of futuristic context in which he's discussing this God, who can only save us now, I do venture that he had Prometheus in mind, and I make specific reference to his rectoral address, where he gave this speech when he became rector of Freiburg University, in which he does specifically name Prometheus as the deity who is the fountainhead of philosophy and science. And he claims that we need to reclaim science in this Promethean sense, this science that's capable of philosophical reflection. So I argue that, yes, that is what he was talking about. And then in Prometheism, I do explicitly appropriate Jung's work in order to make it clearer what Heidegger meant when he talked about, a God, lowercase g, who needs to be recognized as the spirit of technological science, a God that needs to be seen as the daemon that is inspiring this teleology of metaphysics that becomes, modern science and technology. In Prometheism, I go into a discussion of Jungian archetypes and egregores, and I make the claim that there are certain archetypes that are too general or too abstract to produce an egregore. An egregore is a thought form similar to what the Tibetans call a tulpa, a projection on the part of a group of people, a psychical projection, which develops a kind of autonomy and winds up with enough coherence and cohesiveness to endure for some time and act on the world psychokinetically, as it were, with a degree of autonomy from the individuals who projected it, whether subconsciously or consciously, whether accidentally or deliberately. So, and the egregore goes back to the Greek term in the Bible for the watchers, for the fallen angels, which I think is very significant in terms of Prometheus, because the fallen angels, the watchers in the book of Enoch and in the excised parts of Genesis, are the ones who brought knowledge to mankind. They brought all the arts and crafts. They taught the human women that they interbred with all of the arts and sciences. So they're playing this Promethean role. So there's a sense in which egregores in general are Promethean. But bracket that, be that as it may, I say in Prometheism that there are certain archetypes that are too general to produce egregores, like the archetype of the Great Mother. Or there are archetypes that are too abstract, like the archetype of the triangle. And in Jung's discussion of archetypes, it's not clear, frankly, whether sometimes he's using archetype in a more Platonic sense, in the same sense as Plato thinks that archetypes are sort of proto-geometric, that they have a kind of mathematical level of abstraction to them, in which case they exist on some ideal plane and are universally relevant, or whether archetypes are, as Jung sometimes suggests, specific to particular ethnicities and they have a kind of evolutionary history, and therefore only affect certain populations for a finite period of time. So this is an ambiguity in Jung.
Iconotype. That's why I coined the term iconotype, to differentiate from archetype, because archetypes are universal to the entire collective human imagination, but they don't seem to capture the essence that culture moves in terms of epochs. I mean, that's a fact. They move in terms of epoch, and there are governing archi or iconotypes for each of those epochs. So that's why I coined that term, to make a distinction between the archetypes, because the iconotypes of our civilization, the medieval iconotypes, were all Byzantine. They all came from Byzantium. The Fourth Crusade, the West goes over there, ransacks the place, comes back with the archetype of the Virgin and the Child. Giotto sees all this, and he builds paints on the Arena Chapel, the whole life story of the Virgin based on these iconotypes. And the Crucifixion, the Last Supper, a whole bunch of them come in, and then they disintegrate long about what Heidegger calls the advent of the age of the world picture, which is coming in now with the 16th century, where they disintegrate, and the portraits of Christ, especially Christ Pantocrator with the all-seeing gaze from whence you cannot escape, becomes portraits of bourgeois individuals, at first donors, at first the patrons who are hiring the artists to do this. They get in there, but then pretty soon it becomes a fascination with oh, there's this really beautiful woman I want to paint, or this guy is this wealthy burgher. Let's paint him. He's really interesting. And so it begins to set up this new iconotype of the unique individual at the same time that the still life is coming in as an iconotype that develops out of sort of the medieval cult of the relics, the items, the sacred this, the sacred stone, the skull of Adam from out of which the cross grew. These little items get gathered together on trays, and the Dutch are really the first to master this. So we get the iconotype of the still life. Then we also get the iconotype. The big one is infinite space, which then blows apart the world cavern. And starting with Leonardo, especially Mona Lisa, she is the goddess of infinite space now. It's interesting that her name Mona is a contraction of Madonna. It's not Madonna now, it's Mona. And she's this individual who is now the patron goddess of infinite space. You can see correct depth perspective vanishing on the horizon behind her. And that becomes the new iconotype for the Dutch once they step on stage and they start seeing things in terms of, you know, the sky is the most interesting thing in a 17th century Dutch painting. They don't care much about what's going on down below unless you're one of the, I mean, they all specialize, but most of them were painting infinite space. So those become the iconotypes of art down to Manet, Baudelaire, Manet, and that group. When modernism comes in and all of that, Manet is the first to start to disintegrate prospectively correct space. Objects break away, each into their own unique spaces. And then pretty soon with Van Gogh in the second generation, we start getting the hyper object, the object that you cannot see physically with your physical, visible eyes. You can only intuit it with the third eye, the eye of your brain, the object that exists in multiple spaces, multiple temporalities simultaneously, like one of Picasso's paintings where you see the profile as well as the emphased visage at the same time. That becomes the new iconotype. And also Jungian archetypes do come in there at that period with Max Beckmann and Paul Klee and people like that who start painting myths as though they were their own world. So I developed this concept of iconotypes to track the transformations of these archetypes. They change. And like you say here, they are relevant ethnically to specific people, specific times, and specific places. I do like this idea that you're saying that we should be really well aware of what archetype is guiding all of this. Right now, Prometheus. But here's my reservation, is that technologies, especially new ones, have a liquidating effect on archive. They, when new technologies come into being, they have a tendency to be nihilistic. Jane Jacobs talks about this in her treatises about the automobile, how the automobile came into being in the 1950s with the Autopolis coming into being, the interstate highway system. In 1956, shopping mall culture comes in at the exact same time with Victor Gruen, who's the first to design the first shopping mall in Edina, Minnesota in 1956. But the automobile liquidates neighborhoods. With the automobile, the Autopolis now, yeah, you can make the far near and the near far, like Heidegger said, but at the cost of community, at the cost of neighborhoods. So we start seeing neighborhoods disintegrate into these ghettos that break away. And then with the television comes in, it enters into pubs. People stop singing in pubs. That tradition goes away. They're all looking at the television screen up above. And so Neil Postman, who was sort of a disciple of McLuhan in a way, he's like the Jewish version of McLuhan. He's got this conscience about everything that McLuhan didn't care about. McLuhan wasn't interested in evaluating these things in terms of judgments, but Neil Postman was. And he always said this: every time a new technology comes on stage, everybody jumps up and down about it, but the one thing nobody asks is, what way of life will this technology undo? What archive, in other words, are we willing to let this new thing disintegrate and fall away behind us? And so I worry about this. I like the dazzling science fictional possibilities that you're talking about, Jason, with these nanotech guys and all this weird stuff. It's fun. The science fiction addict in me loves that shit. But on the other hand, I worry about it because of the effects that it will have on our archive. You're talking about a necessity, a relation to the archive via the Western canon that's very important to maintain. And I agree totally with that. That's 100%. If you liquidate the Western canon, all kinds of social chaos will come about as the result of that. So the Western archive are embedded in that Western canon, and they do need to be retained. But I just wonder, I mean, you're pretty much, it seems like you're pretty much for all of this innovation. It's Promethean, it's wonderful. Let's see where it takes us. But I worry, the technophobe in me, I like technology, but I don't trust it. The technophobe in me worries that this might be actually an adaptationistic process. Yeah, of a nihilistic process. So that's the point I wanted to make.
Yeah, well, look, I am by no means some, facile optimist about developing technologies. Remember, in Prometheus and Atlas, I go on at length about Prometheus as Frankenstein and as Frankenstein's monster. And Frankenstein's monster in Shelley's work really as a specter that is a projection from out of the psyche of the mad scientist himself. So I certainly think that the Prometheus archetype is potentially monstrous in the way in which it manifests itself in the world. So to go back to what I was saying about archetypes, before you made this useful distinction between iconotypes and archetypes in another more universal sense. I think there are certain archetypes that have a degree of universality, like the Great Mother, or a degree of abstraction, like the triangle, which can never become an egregore. They can never become a thought form. They don't have the requisite specificity to take shape as a kind of autonomous psychical force in the world. Prometheus does. Prometheus is the type of archetype which can also become an egregore. And what I'm arguing in Prometheism...
Can you spell that word? What,
egregore? Egregore, it's E-G-R-E-G-O-R-E.
Okay. I've never encountered it.
I think it was, is it Mark Stavish who wrote a book called Egregores?
Yeah, I have it right here, actually.
Yeah, it's... that book, right? Yeah,
and
so go on, Jason.
Yeah, what I'm arguing is that when Heidegger suggests that the instrumentalizing force of modern technology has a kind of autonomy, that it's expressing a spirit, and it attempts to have us under a kind of, it has us spellbound, and we are something like mesmerically possessed by this inframing network, by the Gestell. We are set up. The Gestell is like the setup, not just in the sense of like a tinker toy construction, but also in the sense of being set up for a crime or a murder. The Gestell is setting us up as a kind of monstrous murderer. It was the Terminator scenario, basically. So what I'm suggesting is that the egregore of Prometheus is already loose in the world. It's an egregore based on an archetype, and it is loose in the world. It is unchained in the form of instrumentalizing modern technology. And so it's not a question of, whether advancing technology has a liquidating effect, as you put it, on our archive. It certainly does. But it does in the same sense that Prometheus is a god against all other gods. Prometheus, in a way, is the ultimate desacralizing force. Prometheus is a sacred ideal, but he's the anti-god among the gods, and there's a danger that the Promethean will desacralize the world in a way that deprives us of our humanity, rather than offering us superhuman potential for further development. So, we simply have to decide whether we want to continue to be sleepwalkers in all of this, or whether we want to recognize the fact that we are projecting this egregore based on the Prometheus archetype. We're projecting this egregore in the gigantic machinery of world enframing technology. And if we become aware of that, there's the possibility that we can control it and reshape it in a way that's more constructive.
You guys, so we're past the 90-minute mark. Jason, could we have you for a little longer? Are you?
You can have me for as long as you like. We just have to be aware not to tire the viewer, because somebody has to sit there and watch this. We forget that sometimes.
I think our viewers are going to really really going to dig this. So, but yeah, we usually try to put a about 90 minutes, we try to check in, and I realized that we didn't check with you earlier how long you wanted to go, but there's still some stuff that I'd like to touch on. John, were you going to say something?
No, I was listening.
Oh, okay. So one thing interesting before I go on to the next thing, Jason, with we were talking about the last God, and with Jung, an interesting thing that made me think about was Carl Jung's one of his later books is called Ion, and he looks at the sort of synchronicity, as you might call it, of the astrological procession of the equinoxes and the beginning of Christendom with its correlation with the constellation of Pisces, and he's sort of looking at how the first age of Christendom is defined by the vertical facing direction of the Pisces constellation, the two fishes that are kind of formed like an L, the one fish that goes upwards vertically, the sort of otherworldly orientation of the early Christian era that when it was influenced by Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, and then at about around 1500 or so, there's the sort of Faustian shift into the horizontal, the Antichrist fish, as Jung calls it, which goes up till about 2000. And so Ion ends with Jung sort of suggesting the precession of the equinoxes going into the new age, the age of Aquarius, as it's been called, and it was a kind of popular meme in the 1960s and stuff like that. And what's interesting to me about that is that Aquarius, I think that you maybe talk about this somewhere, is that the next age, then, if we're going with the precession of the equinoxes, if the spring point is going backwards to the zodiac every 2,100 years or so, then we would be on the verge of the Aquarius eon now, after the end of the age of Pisces. And I think that, I could be wrong about this, but I think that you make a connection between the Aquarius sign and image and Prometheus. So that's interesting that if that through synchronicity, if you're interested in astrology at all, this connection then between the last God, or the God who can save us now, Prometheus, and then Jung talking about going into the age of Aquarius. He doesn't quite put it that way, but I think that is interesting, that if Aquarius is connected to Prometheus, the water bearer, and there's different ways that you can imagine what exactly he's carrying. He does mention this, and this is shifting gears into maybe the final thing that we can talk about that I really was hoping to get into. Jung is a little bit more explicit about the Aquarius age in one of his last books, written in, I think, in 1958 or 1959, called Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the sky, where he does, in the introduction there, talk about this shift and that as we're transitioning into this new age, we're seeing signs and portents in the sky, with the flying saucer phenomena, as he was calling it. And so this leads up into something that is one of the things I really loved about Prometheus and Atlas. Anybody who's knows me and has heard me talk, like on the Hypermodernity podcast and stuff like that, knows that I'm kind of a UFO fanatic, and I actually did my graduate thesis on the UFO phenomena. It's something that I find really fascinating, and I don't know how anybody who's actually honestly looked at the phenomena, looked at the research on it, the data on it, and how you couldn't be absolutely just fascinated by this stuff once you come to realize that this is a real phenomena. And you have a chapter, Mercurial Hermeneutics, which I think is the last chapter in Prometheus and Atlas, where you go over the work of Jacques Vallée. You summarize a lot of his work. He's one of my heroes. And we're in a very strange time right now in 2020, or at least going back to 2018 even. But since at least I think it was in March, the Pentagon officially said that released these UFO videos, the Tic Tac UFO. That, anybody that watches the Joe Rogan shows heard about this a lot. What's his name? Frazier, the Navy pilot that chased this thing. And anyway, so we seem to be in this era now where, like, almost like every month there's official recognition, almost like a trickle-down effect of UFO reality. And there's just something that just came out a few days ago. I actually sent John this, I think it was like a New York magazine article that talks about Eric W. Davis had briefed the Pentagon that there are these off-world vehicles that we may even have some remnants of. So there's this interesting thing going on right now which I think is a kind of case study, a case example of hypermodernity, that we are in a post-disclosure era right now, and the implications of that I think are tremendous. But part of this, and by the disclosure I mean there was this disclosure movement that was using the Freedom of Information Act and putting pressure on politicians to release information about UFO reality, what the government and the military-industrial complex might know about UFO reality. And what's significant is that since 2018 and March of 2020, is that there's been a policy of denial and ridicule about UFO reality going back at least to the 1940s, and then the Condon report that came out, I think, in the late 1960s, that closed Project Blue Book, where this was the thing that on an official level, and then passed down through the mainstream media, that UFOs are not real, they're not important, they're not of scientific interest, and so you see that that's changed now. That's changed at least since 2018, where I remember, I think it was like on Fox News, Tucker Carlson showed a video of the Tic Tac UFO event. I remember it happened to be when I was actually in Santa Fe. Me and John watched this video for the first time, and it was, in my mind, I mean, this was like unbelievable that we're actually seeing this, because I know the history of the phenomenon, the way it's been treated by the media, which has always been ridiculed and always been denied, and now that's changed. So we're in a post-disclosure era where this phenomenon is now being seen as real and acknowledged as real. But part of the hypermodern semiotics of this is that nobody seems to care, and I think that this is an example of hypermodernity, at least in the sense of something that I wrote about in the preface to the first book, about the collapse of the real and the imaginary, and creating this integral reality, which is a term from Jean Baudrillard, where the distinction between real and imaginary, it's we used to divide these things up, is no longer tenable, and there's, the real and the imaginary are collapsed together in this way, and the disclosure movement is sort of based on this presupposition that the government is still an authority that can say something is real and people will believe it. And what we're seeing is that, well, that's not the case, especially during a Trump administration, which might be why some of this information is coming out now, because people just generally, don't trust Donald Trump for good reasons or bad reasons. It doesn't really matter. The fact is that it seems that the presuppositions of the disclosure movement, that the government, the official level, can recognize the reality of UFOs, and people would include UFOs in the real. That doesn't seem to be happening now. It seems that there is no arbiter of what is real. You see these news articles come out, and then there's one, then the comments on it are just about conspiracies, and one, it's almost like it doesn't matter now. UFO reality has been revealed. We're in a post-disclosure movement, but nobody seems to care or believe it. Who is the arbiter of the real today? Nobody seems to know. But anyway, so that was just sort of my aside. But you write about UFOs, and I should have mentioned earlier that you're also on New Thinking Aloud with Jeffrey Mishlove a lot. You have many episodes with him, and you talk about UFOs and stuff like that, and other parapsychological phenomena. You also mentioned this breakaway civilization phenomena. Anyway, so I just wanted to ask you about UFOs, flying saucers. What do you think is going on there, and how that connects to Prometheism? And yeah, So that was my long way of getting to that. So maybe this could be the final gear that we wrap up on between both of us, or go from there.
Okay, so I'm going to try to relatively concisely respond to that very complex train of thought. Going back to the beginning of it, where you were talking about Aquarius and Prometheus, I think that what you had in mind is the opening of Prometheus and Atlas, where I'm describing how the Prometheus statue at Rockefeller Center is emerging from out of the ring of the zodiacal constellations. And I'm suggesting that, this sculpture and the sculpture of Atlas across from St. Patrick's Cathedral are, they are meant to herald the transition to the age of Aquarius. And the reason why there's an emphasis on this astrological symbolism in those two sculptures is to suggest that the age of Aquarius should have a Promethean spirit. If you read the inscription that John Rockefeller set up there, in front of the statue, and wisdom and knowledge, as tribute to wisdom and knowledge behind the statue of Prometheus, I think that there's a sense that the Aquarian age is supposed to be driven by this Promethean ethos, as opposed to the Christian ethos that defined the Piscean age. So I think that's what you were remembering in Prometheus and Atlas, but it brings me to some remarks on astrology more generally, on the way to discussing UFOs, on the way to discussing close encounters, because these are actually related phenomena, I think. In Prometheism, I actually go into a discussion of astrology, and in particular, the research of Michel Gauquelin, who presented evidence to the Belgian Belgian Committee of Skeptics, the equivalent of SciCop in the United States. He presented evidence that was favorably evaluated by them for the idea that certain planets do have an influence on the personality type of an individual, depending on where they're positioned at the time of the birth of that individual. So at least the planetary aspects of a person's natal chart do appear to correlate to the profession that they wind up going into, like Mars and soldiers, for example. And he called the whole thing the Mars effect because of that very clear correlation between people in military careers and the prominence of the planet Mars. Now, I go into this in Prometheism with reference to Jung's analysis of astrology through the lens of his synchronicity concept. And I argue that Jung's concept of synchronicity is philosophically incoherent. And it's very sloppy. And, for something like synchronicity to actually work would require an extremely complex nexus of psychokinesis. So that even if there are archetypes aligning events in the world in accordance with them, it's not as if they do this acausally. Jung is working with too narrow a conception of causality. He thinks of causality only in terms of the efficient causality that predominated in modern metaphysics and modern science. But there are four causes in Aristotle, and there are formal causes, formative causation, and final causes, teleologies, that would need to be employed in any causal account of how something like synchronicity could work. And it would require basically an incredibly complex nexus of psychokinetic effects operating through the collective unconscious and so forth, okay? Just bracket that. The point is this, that Jung identifies astrological influences as one of the types of synchronistic phenomena. And I pick a bone with him over this, and I suggest that actually, if there's empirical evidence for the efficacy of astrology, which unfortunately, and I consider it very unfortunate, there is such evidence, we really have to call into question what kind of a cosmos we're living in, because all of these attempts to naturalistically explain astrology in terms of something like the tidal influence of the moon on the liquids in our bodies, it's preposterous. It's, it's utterly preposterous to think that there's some kind of a naturalistic explanation for how the planet Mars is going to compel you to enter a certain field and excel in a certain career. Okay, it just doesn't work. There's no naturalistic account you're going to be able to give of that. But if we live in an information processing system, and if the Greeks were right that the cosmos is bound together by logos, that there is a narrative, there's an intrinsically narrative structure to the cosmos, and we're living in an information processing system that that reserves a primary role for symbols, and we are like avatars on quests in some kind of a gigantic game. Heraclitus said the aeon is a child at play, moving pieces in a game. Sovereignty belongs to the child. So if we're living in some kind of a cosmic game that has an intrinsically narrative structure where the planets have symbolic value because it's an information processing system, then you can start to make sense of how astrology might work. Okay, so I go into that at length in Prometheism, and I look at aspects.
And that is what Jacques Vallée thinks as well, that we live in an kind of like a simulation, that we live in an information processing universe.
System. He calls it a control system. So then to come back to Prometheus, the question is how much control we want to have over this system, right? So if we have been engaged by superior intelligences, let's say, okay? Not to call them alien, because we don't necessarily know that they have an alien biology. We don't necessarily know that they're coming from other planets. We have been engaged in the form of the UFO phenomenon by what appear to be superior intelligences. Now, they could be coming from a higher reference level, a kind of hyperspace in this information processing system. And I think that Jacques Vallée was leaning toward that hypothesis in his writings in the 80s and the 90s. And if that's the case, then they represent a kind of Olympian pantheon. And it is our task to take a Promethean stance with respect to that. In other words, to affirm that and recognize that, come to terms with the perhaps unfortunate fact that we are living in a kind of cosmic game, but that we intend to hack this system and recode it and take control of the narrative of our lives and determine our own destinies, become the masters of the quest that we're on inside of this cosmic game, rather than being the playthings of these hyperdimensional archons. Now, what Jung suggests in his book on flying saucers that you cited was that flying saucers are archetypes being psychokinetically projected from out of the collective unconscious in order to compensate for the predominance of mechanistic instrumentality, for the kind of alienation that we've experienced on account of modern technology. And so this force that would have expressed itself in the form of fairies or elves or whatever in a pre-modern culture, or in the form of angels in the context of medieval civilization, this force is expressing itself as a technologically superior intelligence because this is the only knock on our skulls hard enough to get us to wake up to our existential situation in this epoch, right? And if Jung is right about that on some level, then it means that this Olympian pantheon has a kind of mercurial or hermetic quality to it. It is not purely oppositional. Its intention is to catalyze a reaction against itself. So it's sort of calling forth a challenge. It's seeing if we are up to the task of determining our own destiny, which reminds me of that film, The Adjustment Bureau, that was based on the Philip K. Dick story, The Adjustment Team. That's very much the sense there, that, until this politician gets up to the highest level of this Kafkaesque bureaucracy that he's facing, it appears as if, they are simply Gnostic archons out to, derail his life and to, exercise some kind of sadistic control over the world. But in fact, it turns out that the chairman is interested in testing the mettle of the protagonist and forcing him to draw on his own resources in order to define his own destiny. So, I mean, and this is the sense of the last lines in Prometheus and Atlas, where I say that, a new world is on offer to us, but only if we can steal it and only if we can bear it. If we can't take this new world, if we can't take it, both in the sense of being able to bear it like Atlas, or in the sense of taking it as in stealing the fire, as Prometheus would, then it will destroy us. This challenge will destroy us. But if we're up to the task, then I think we will experience a revolutionary transformation from humanity into a Promethean post-humanity.
So it's almost like the UFOs are offering a challenge to us.
Exactly.
As this evidence accumulates, it's putting a pressure on us to step up to the task, which kind of reminds me of the Aquarius symbol of, it's an image of the anthropos, an image of man who's bearing, or like an image of Atlas, like on the cover of your book. It's like the Farnese Atlas. You can see that, but they're carrying the thing. It's like, if these metamaterials from these objects, so let's say they're real, and wherever they come from, and they're in our hands, and we can do it. It's like we can traverse time and space in the snap of a finger. We can create any reality, but are we really up to the task? And in some sense, you're sort of saying that part of being up to the task also involves some kind of like discipline in tradition as well. Like it's not just anything goes. We have to understand the history. We have to understand what what our heritage is, in a sense, in the Western civilization of Prometheus civilization, and tearing down statues and the Western canon of literature, which is meant to educate and discipline us. We have to go through that disciplining process if we're going to be able to take on the UFO. If we're going to be able to use these things and reach our destiny, I guess, is kind of how I maybe the optimistic side of what I think you're saying.
Let me just
John, go on. Yeah, go on. Yeah.
Maybe bring in Occam's razor here. Maybe the simplest. These are pretty. Enjoy these explanations, but they're pretty elaborate and baroquely convoluted. What I'm wondering is, what if it's just aliens from another world coming to check us out? What if that's exactly what it appears to be, is exactly what it is?
It could be both. I mean, because part of it is that maybe we don't even know what reality even is, or what we are. I mean, so what does that?
I never thought that. For years, I spent decades thinking that somehow this was some sort of an activation in the psyche of a shamanic death rebirth experience, because shamans also get abducted by ancestor beings who take them, do experiments on them. They remove all their internal organs and put special organs inside their bodies, like crystals. They give them all this new power. And I thought for the longest time that somehow the similarities between the abduction accounts and the shamanic accounts must mean that somehow that experience of shamanism gets activated in certain individuals. They may be totally ordinary, nothing else special about them. But for years I was going with that, but now I'm not so sure. Now I'm wondering if it really is just aliens from other worlds coming to check us out. I'm kind of leaning toward the Occam version of all this. So anyways, I just thought I'd throw that out there as another possibility.
Okay. Well, we could do this all day, but okay, Jason, the breakaway civilization idea, something about. Okay, so I mean, you have this idea of a breakaway civilization. Is your idea of the breakaway civilization different than Richard Dolan's idea of the breakaway civilization?
It's more disturbing. I think that it's compatible, but it's more disturbing in the sense that, and here I owe a lot more research-wise to Joseph Farrell. I think that there is a legitimately, there is a character to this civilization that's legitimately describable as fascist. And it's even proto-fascist because you can see the inception of the breakaway civilization in the nexus of Prussian industry, intelligence, and corporate colonialism in the Americas as early as the 1890s. And some of the same people who were involved in, now I know in your book Clouds, Michael, you take a kind of like Jungian approach to the airship mystery of the 1890s. I am more inclined to see that as a set of encounters with material technology. Because if you trace the business connections between the Sonora Aero Club that was supposedly manufacturing some of these airships and Prussian nationalists who were being funded by J.P. Morgan and his associates out of New York, you see that this is like the incipient stage of the military-industrial complex that winds up reaching its culmination in Nazi Germany. So I make this argument in the book Prometheism, and it's only very superficially reflected in the manifesto. But I make this extensive argument in Prometheism, and also in an essay that was printed in Lovers of Sophia, an essay called Black Sunrise. I make the case that you had a group of industrialists and predominantly Germanic aristocrats break off of publicly acknowledged technological development and start to develop a clandestine economy and industry which used Nazi Germany as a kind of field laboratory in the 1930s and 40s, and then was harvested by America post-1945 through paperclip, so that all of these thousands of German scientists like Werner von Braun, who were, repatriated to the United States, they formed a kind of nucleus of a Fourth Reich inside the American military, industrial, and intelligence apparatus. They formed the nucleus of a kind of Fourth Reich that harvested the technological breakthroughs of the Third Reich. And I see these people as incredibly competent in social engineering and psychological warfare, to the extent that they were actually behind some of the most radically countercultural phenomenon of the 60s, the late 60s, with the rise of the drug culture, the milieu around Charlie Manson in the late 60s. I think that these phenomena were meant to be accelerants with the aim of precipitating the terminal decline and collapse of liberal democratic Western culture, so that from out of that chaos, they could build essentially a Fourth Reich. And, the intelligent component of this is very important. Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex, but it's really the military-industrial intelligence complex. In addition to paperclip, what happened from 1945 to 1947 was the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, authorized by the National Security Act of 1947, the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency through a synergy between the OSS, the wartime U.S. intelligence agency, a synergy between the OSS and something called the Gehlen Network. This was General Reinhard Gehlen's network of Nazi spies in Eastern Europe. So, the Nazis they'd pushed into Russia, and they already had a vast intelligence network in Eastern Europe. Once we realized that we would be in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, rather than try to develop our own intelligence network behind Soviet lines from East Berlin all the way to Moscow, we absorbed lock, stock, and barrel this Nazi Eastern European intelligence network called the Gehlen right into what became the CIA. The CIA was co-constituted at its foundation by unreconstructed Nazis. And it's from out of that you eventually get George Herbert Walker Bush as the director of Central Intelligence. So in Prometheism, I'm warning about this fascistic breakaway civilization and its attempt to use deconstruction, multiculturalism, identity politics, and so forth as accelerants in order to precipitate the terminal decline and collapse of Western liberal democracy for the purpose of, you know, a new imperium based on hegemonic white identity politics from out of that chaos. And this is something that I'm calling us to resist on the basis of a Promethean ethos. I see it as an incipient tyranny, and you know, I'm calling for a Promethean rebellion against it. But it's a Promethean rebellion that also attempts to seduce those people inclined toward fascism who are coming from a kind of futurist perspective. The people who were in Marinetti's circle who wound up doing business with Mussolini. So I think it's possible that we can bring some of those people over to our side and compel them to turn against this cabal and, you know, articulate a vision of the future that's less cynical and that, you know, that is more affirming of human possibility and, you know, our revolutionary potential.
Jason, what's your position with regard to the alt-right? Because I get the sense that you started with them. It seems like you were with Arctos, the publisher there. It seemed like you were close with Richard Spencer for a bit there, but that you left them. I got the sense that you got disillusioned at some point. You walked away. What's your position now with the alt-right?
Well, my books are read by a lot of people who gravitated toward the alt-right, who were within that sphere while it was a coherent phenomenon. I think, frankly, the alt-right is dead at this point. That thing that really coalesced in 2016 and that I played a role in, you know, sort of organizing and attempting to set onto a certain trajectory, that thing has basically imploded at this point, I would say. I think it's going to reemerge in another form, and I'm very concerned about the form in which it will reemerge. But that version of it is basically defunct at this point. And I mean, my point of contention with those folks was obviously, you know, in terms of the contrast between my Promethean outlook and their traditionalism. And so I was attempting to reorient the whole thing in the direction of kind of Promethean futurism. Yeah. And, you know, to go back to the ideas that, you know, the Italian futurists were advocating for in the 1920s before they wound up being co-opted by Mussolini and then somehow, you know, integrated into the project of the Third Reich. So my involvement with the alt-right was about fundamentally recalibrating the trajectory of a movement that I saw as, you know, dangerously xenophobic, isolationist, regressively traditionalist. And I was developing this vision of a global Indo-European community based on a forward-thinking Promethean ethos. And to be quite honest with you, you know, and I'll say as much about this as I have gone on record saying before in some of my blog posts, which have subsequently been deleted, but, you know, this was in the public sphere, so I'll repeat it to a certain level of detail. My project in the alt-right was not some, you know, chaotic, like, romantic fantasy that I was pursuing on my own.
The Scandinavian gods and that kind of thing.
No, it was not some, you know, personal, you know, fantasy of recalibrating the alt-right in this Promethean direction and moving from white identity politics to global Indo-European community. It was backed by individuals who claimed that they were going to offer the resources to make sure the movement went in this direction. And in particular, these individuals were part of the Salvaged Intelligence Directorate of Blackwater. I got involved with these people. They promised considerable resources, and I conscientiously believed that there was a danger of a virulent white identity politics and a xenophobic kind of European isolationism. And I wanted to get ahead of that and recalibrate this movement in a way that would allow it to become a platform for embracing the Promethean ethos. And so when these individuals came to me and offered the resources to build an institution, namely the Alt-Right Corporation, that would unify all of the various instruments of the movement at that time, the Red Ice Radio and television, the Arctos Press, and the National Policy Institute of Richard Spencer, I agreed to be this unifying figure with the intention of recalibrating the trajectory of the entire movement, backed by significant resources which never materialized. And that's the whole story of, you know, why did these resources not materialize? What was the intention really on the part of these individuals? And, you know, sometimes I think you can reconstruct motive from consequences, what actually wound up happening with that whole thing, and with my career.
You've gone back to Arctos Press, though, for the new book, right? So has there been some sort of a reconciliation?
You know, in the course of working with Arctos and developing a readership within those circles, I've realized that, perhaps sadly, this is the most vibrant intellectual community there is.
I see.
You know, we were talking about other presses, which I won't name, and, you know, other circles of intellectuals and publishing companies before we began recording.
Did you try Zero Books?
Which one?
Did you try Zero Books by any chance? It's just a joke.
You know, I'm sorry to tell you I did. I actually submitted Prometheus and Atlas to them for consideration. It was one of the many rejections I got. So don't think that you know, okay, anyway, let me just stop myself. You get my point, that I realized actually in the course of a tangible relationship with these individuals, both, you know, the editors and the people on the staff of Arctos, and also the readership, that, you know, these are where the most interesting ideas are, and they're ideas that are very different from one another. Alexander Dugin is saying something completely different from Guillaume Fay, who you know, is viewed with some disdain by Alain de Benoit. I mean, these ideas are all very distinct from one another. There's an intellectual vibrance and diversity on the right that you just don't find on the left anymore, sadly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a PC authoritarians, is, you know, and you can't really have a, you know, it should be about people having different ideas, and that's okay if you have different ideas. You know, you could still be friends, you could still be family, but there's this crazy idea now where if you disagree on something, then you have to be canceled, or we see there's this. Anyway, but well, that's. I should also say to John's audience that in one of your videos with Jeffrey Mishlove on New Thinking Aloud, there's a video called I think it's called "Who is Jason Reza Jorjani?" Response to a libel, which is a really great video. It's a great introduction to your work and a good summary, I think, of some of the stuff that you're talking about here, of what happened and all that stuff. And I think people should check that out, along with all those videos that you've done with Jeffrey. Until John comes back,
yeah,
could you? Oh, you're here. I just wanted to ask Jason, your relationship with Jeffrey Mishlove. He seems like such an amazing guy. He's such a great guy from just watching his videos over the years. And what has that been like, doing all the, because you do a lot of great videos with him, and there's a lot of respect. And you dedicated Prometheus and Atlas to him as well, which I thought was really, really cool. So the story with Jeffrey is that I actually grew up watching the original Thinking Aloud. When I was an adolescent, well, a teenager more so, I'd say 15, 16,
I used to watch, maybe even younger than that, I used to watch the original Thinking Aloud program on public television.
Yeah, I grew up.
Yeah, and so did I. And so it deeply impacted me. I mean, for example, I found books like Michael Talbot's The Holographic Universe through that, and Rupert Sheldrake's work. And, you know, it was just a treasure trove of interesting ideas that had a fundamental impact on my development as a thinker. So when I wrote Prometheus and Atlas, in the dissertation version, the original dissertation version of Prometheus and Atlas, I included a discussion of the PK Man, Jeffrey Mishlov's book about this psychokinetic adept who claimed to be in contact with, you know, space intelligences.
SIs, yeah. Ted Owens, right? Ted Owens.
Ted Owens.
What a crazy story! What a wild story that is.
Yes. So I wrote to Jeffrey when I was a doctoral candidate and sent him a draft of my dissertation, and that began our correspondence. And then after Prometheus and Atlas was written, but before it had even been published, he invited me over to at that time he was living in Las Vegas, to record a conversation together. And here's how it actually went. This is an interesting story that hasn't been told publicly, if I'm not mistaken. It's that Jeff said to me, because you know, he knew that Thinking Aloud had this deep impact on me, and he said, well, why don't we have some conversations over Skype that we'll record together? And I said, well, you know, I really don't like Skype, and you know, I don't think that's going to make for a good interaction. Now, if you ever develop a studio again like you had in the days of Thinking Aloud, I would love to do programs like that together with you.
Right.
So he went and he put black fabric all around one of the rooms of his office. If you look back at the early videos, the new Thinking Aloud, it's extremely rough. There are these two beat-up chairs, and there's this black fabric on the walls. So he created a makeshift studio, and he did a few tests with other prominent people in parapsychology that are in his circles, close friends of his. He did a few test interviews and then invited me to Las Vegas to record a program in this makeshift studio. And that was the inception of the new Thinking Aloud as a program.
That's awesome. I love it. That's great. I love hearing that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's really cool. Well, I mean, I'm thinking, man, I wish we could go all day with this. I mean, we should definitely do this again. Maybe we could do some, I don't know if you guys are comfortable doing like a kind of like a closing statement. Maybe we could start with John. Is there something you want to say to wrap it up, and then we'll have Jason as our guest to give a final statement on Prometheism, maybe
not really.
Hypermodernity, Prometheism.
No, not really. Just that I've enjoyed this conversation immensely, and probably my favorite video that we've done so far. So I'll say that.
Yeah.
You know, without hyperbole, I feel exactly the same way. This is probably the most enjoyable interview that I have done, certainly over the internet. And, you know, I really am grateful for the opportunity, gentlemen.
Yeah, it's wonderful discussing with someone, Jason, who's equally erudite in history and well-versed in civilization, because people, they don't learn. History is a dead world. I mean, nobody learns it anymore. And none of these other public intellectuals, I won't name them, know it. They don't know it because it takes time to sit down and log in the hours with the fucking books, and it takes forever. But yeah, so I'm really delighted that we got the chance to do this interaction. It's as good as I knew that it would be. I'll just say that. So
Awesome.
Thank you both. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah,
thanks, Jason. We could do this again, right? Hopefully, we could do this at some point again.
I'm yours anytime.
Okay,
awesome.
I would love that. Okay, guys, everyone, have a good night. Awesome.
Thank you, everybody. Take care out there, and we'll see you again. See you soon.
Okay,
good night. Bye.